Something extraordinary is developing in Washington at this moment, and it is not originating from Democrats. For the first time, Republicans are actively resisting Donald Trump. They are operating discreetly but deliberately to obstruct the authority he is attempting to consolidate regardless of cost. Emergency proclamations, war-level language, behind-the-scenes alarm. Congress is intervening to establish boundaries. This is not just another political confrontation or breaking news cycle. This is an examination of whether American authority is governed by legal frameworks or by one individual's instincts. Remain with me through the end, because what is unfolding here could transform how power operates in the United States long after these headlines disappear. Imagine this scene late at night in Washington, phones illuminating across Capitol Hill, aides conferring quietly in corridors, senators checking their devices twice, verifying what they are reading is accurate, because the President of the United States is enraged, not at Democrats, not at media organizations, but at his own political party. And for the first time in years, the opposition is not coming from demonstrators outside the gates. It is emerging from inside the establishment. That is where genuine danger always originates. Republicans are revolting against Donald Trump. And no, this is not the typical MAGA internal conflict or anonymous disclosures designed to alarm donors. This is something deeper, more calculated, and far more significant, because it strikes at the one element Trump believes he cannot survive without: unrestricted authority. The reason this uprising matters extends beyond broken commitments, though those exist as well. Whether it is the pledge of no new military conflicts, the escalating cost of living, or unanswered questions about long-promised revelations that never materialize. What makes this different is that Republican legislators themselves are openly moving against the very power Trump is desperate to maintain. And when the institutional safeguards inside the system begin to activate, presidents do not respond with composure. They intensify. They create drama. They declare emergencies. That is precisely what we are observing unfold at this moment. A presidency leaning heavily into performance and crisis terminology to protect itself from internal disintegration. At the center of this revolt exists a simple but disturbing reality that even experienced Washington observers are struggling to articulate publicly. The President of the United States has been publicly considering the concept of using military force in ways that could pull America into confrontation, not with some distant opponent, but with its own alliance partners. When Senator Chris Murphy presented this in direct terms, it landed with impact, because once you remove the rhetoric in the presentation, you are left with a scenario that sounds irrational until you remember we have stopped being permitted to dismiss these declarations as humour. Greenland is not empty space on a property acquisition map. It is territory of Denmark. Denmark is a NATO ally, and NATO's fundamental principle is collective protection. Any military action against that territory is not merely symbolic. It is a legal and strategic catastrophe that theoretically places the United States in direct conflict with Europe. The fact that lawmakers now must seriously explain this to the public is itself evidence of how unmoored the conversation has become. No one in America voted for a presidency that risks armed conflict with allies over territorial acquisition rhetoric. Yet here we are passing statements, evaluating hypotheticals, and watching members of Trump's own party quietly but firmly attempting to close the door before it gets forced open. This is where Trump's perspective becomes essential to understanding the resistance. He does not process international relations as alliances or agreements or shared security commitments. He processes it like real estate, like negotiating leverage, like a transaction that can be compelled if you apply sufficient pressure. That mindset might function in a corporate negotiation. In global politics, it produces casualties. Republican senators understand this. They recognize that once a president frames military action as an option, the institutional machinery begins moving whether Congress approves or not. which is why the War Powers Act suddenly became the contested ground, not as an abstract constitutional discussion, but as an emergency mechanism. And when that mechanism was activated, when Republicans joined Democrats to advance a resolution limiting the president's capacity to act unilaterally, Trump did not respond with discussion or persuasion. He responded with fury, profanity, and intimidation. Because that is what occurs when someone who believes authority is personal discovers it is actually conditional. The reported phone conversation with Senator Susan Collins was not just about one vote. It was about the shock of realizing that loyalty has boundaries, that even in his own party there are limits that cannot be crossed without opposition. For Trump, that opposition feels existential. His entire second-term approach depends on projecting dominance, inevitability, and control. Nothing undermines that faster than members of your own party publicly telling you no, especially when the issue at stake is military authority, constitutional boundaries, and war powers. This is where the narrative accelerates. Confronted with resistance, Trump does not withdraw, he reframes. He reaches for emergency language, declaring extraordinary measures not just as policy instruments, but as political weapons. The proclamation of a national emergency connected to Venezuelan oil assets fits perfectly into this pattern. It allows him to position himself as the sole defender of national security, while portraying dissenting lawmakers as obstacles, even though the underlying reality is far more complicated, involving extended timelines, massive corporate interests, uncertain infrastructure, and benefits that would flow primarily to multinational energy corporations rather than ordinary Americans. But complexity has never been the objective. The objective is dominance, distraction, and narrative control. Because emergencies change the parameters. Emergencies centralize authority. Emergencies shift attention away from uncomfortable inquiries. And there are few inquiries more uncomfortable for this administration at this moment than why long-promised transparency initiatives have stalled, why document releases have been postponed, and why it required bipartisan pressure rather than executive initiative to advance certain oversight actions. When lawmakers like Sheldon Whitehouse begin discussing openly about inspectors general, compliance failures, and unanswered timelines, it signals something important. Not a conclusion, not an allegation, but concern that process itself has deteriorated. That concern is precisely what Trump cannot accommodate. His political survival depends not just on winning arguments, but on exhausting the public, flooding the information environment, and keeping every controversy competing for attention. These elements, Republican revolt, war powers, emergency declarations, stalled disclosures, are not separate narratives. They are the same narrative viewed from different perspectives. A presidency attempting to outrun accountability by accelerating disorder. And Republicans who once approved everything are now calculating the cost of silence, weighing institutional damage against party allegiance, and recognizing that if they do not act now, they may not recognize the system later. Because once a president openly suggests he is guided only by his own evaluation and not by law, agreements, or precedent, the question stops being partisan. It becomes structural. That is the moment we occupy. Behind closed doors, Republicans are asking themselves whether stopping Trump is an act of disloyalty or an act of preservation. History does not remember who tweeted the loudest. It remembers who intervened when the rules were bending past their breaking point. This revolt, quiet in some places, explosive in others, may be the first genuine sign that the internal safeguards are finally being tested, not by the opposition, but by those who understand exactly how dangerous unrestricted power can become when it is wrapped in grievance, performance, and the language of permanent emergency. As this internal rebellion intensifies, the real story shifts from what Trump is stating publicly to what Republicans are doing privately. Behind the cameras, behind the social media outrage and carefully worded declarations, there is a growing recognition among GOP lawmakers that they are no longer dealing with a conventional presidency, but with a leader who perceives every institutional limit as a personal attack. That realization is changing behavior in ways that would have been inconceivable just a year earlier. When the War Powers Resolution advanced with the Republican votes, it was not an accident or a momentary lapse in party discipline. It was a calculated move by senators who understand that once the executive branch normalizes unilateral military threats, especially toward allied territory, Congress becomes irrelevant unless it reasserts itself. That concern is not ideological, it is constitutional. The War Powers Act exists precisely for moments like this. Moments when a president's instincts outrun the system protections. The fact that Trump reacted with profanity, intimidation, and threats of political destruction only reinforces the concern that his decision-making is driven less by strategy and more by impulse, grievance, and legacy fixation. Legacy is a critical term here. Trump's obsession with being remembered, with being perceived as dominant, transformative, and historically consequential, has increasingly collided with the reality that his promises have not translated into stability, prosperity, or restraint. When the narrative of no new wars collapses under the weight of military rhetoric, even loyal supporters begin to fracture, because wars are not abstractions to voters. They are expenses, risks, and consequences. Republicans facing re-election understand that no amount of presentation can sell a conflict with allies as a victory. Trump's turn toward emergency powers feels less like leadership and more like alarm. Emergencies allow him to bypass discussion, marginalize dissent, and recast opposition as sabotage. This tactic has a long history, not just in American politics, but globally, where leaders who feel their authority slipping reach for extraordinary measures to freeze the political moment in their favor. The Venezuelan oil emergency is a textbook example of how economic assets are framed as security imperatives, even when the practical benefits are distant, uncertain, and largely corporate. The language of emergency is not about timelines or feasibility. It is about presentation, control, and narrative dominance. While the administration insists this move is about protecting American interests, lawmakers on both sides of the aisle perceive something else, a strategic distraction designed to shift attention away from congressional oversight, internal party dissent, and growing scrutiny of executive follow-through. This is where Trump's relationship with his own party becomes increasingly adversarial. He does not just want support, he demands submission. When senators assert independence, he treats it as betrayal rather than governance, publicly threatening their careers while privately depending on their votes for judicial confirmations, legislative priorities, and institutional cover. That contradiction exposes the fragility of his position. Power that relies on fear rather than coalition eventually turns inward. We are watching that process unfold in real time as Republican senators quietly coordinate, compare notes, and decide when and how to draw lines that were once unthinkable to draw. This internal calculation is fueled by a broader concern that Trump's rhetoric about law, morality, and authority is no longer symbolic, but operational. When a president suggests he is governed by personal judgment rather than international law or constitutional constraint, it signals a worldview in which rules exist only when convenient. That worldview terrifies lawmakers who understand that precedent outlives presidencies. If these norms collapse now, they will not magically reappear later. This anxiety has turned routine votes into flashpoints, phone calls into confrontations, and policy disagreements into existential tests of institutional survival. All of this is happening against a backdrop of mounting public confusion and fatigue, where voters struggle to separate performance from substance. That confusion is not accidental, it is strategic. A crowded information environment benefits those who thrive on disorder. Trump has always understood that if everything is breaking news, nothing is accountability, which is why the convergence of these stories matters so much. The war powers fight, the emergency declaration, the Republican revolt, the stalled disclosures, These are not isolated controversies. They are interconnected stress fractures in a system being pushed beyond its design. Republicans who once rationalized every action as temporary or tactical are now confronting the possibility that silence is no longer neutral, that inaction itself becomes a form of consent. That realization has changed the tone inside the party from loyalty to damage control. They are no longer asking how to help Trump win the next news cycle. They are asking how to prevent irreversible damage to the institutions they still need to function after he is gone. That shift, subtle but profound, is why this revolt feels different. Quieter in some ways, but far more serious. It is driven not by ideology, but by alarm, by lawmakers who understand that when emergency powers become routine and war rhetoric becomes casual, the line between governance and authoritarianism blurs, and once that line disappears, it rarely comes back without a cost. That cost is what Republicans are now trying, perhaps belatedly, to avoid, even as Trump escalates attacks and frames every check on his power as an attack on the nation itself, because in his mind, the two are inseparable. And that belief, more than any single policy or controversy, is what has finally pushed members of his own party into open resistance, setting the stage for an internal confrontation that will define not just this presidency, but the future balance of power long after the headlines fade. While the public argument rages over war powers and emergency declarations, a quieter, more unsettling pressure is building beneath the surface. Every time the administration escalates the language of crisis, it inadvertently shines a light on what it seems most eager to outrun: oversight, documentation, timelines, and the slow, methodical work of accountability. This is where the story takes a darker, more procedural turn, not into conspiracy or rumour, but into the uncomfortable territory of process failures and unanswered questions. When lawmakers begin asking why promised disclosures are delayed, why reviews stretch on indefinitely, and why statutory deadlines slip without explanation, they are not alleging conclusions. They are identifying red flags. Red flags are dangerous not because they prove wrongdoing, but because they invite scrutiny. And scrutiny is the one thing a presidency built on speed, spectacle, and dominance struggles to manage. The discussion around delayed document releases has become sensitive precisely because the administration itself elevated these disclosures into a defining promise, signalling urgency, prioritization, and transparency, only for reality to unfold far more slowly than rhetoric suggested. When senators began publicly describing the gap between expectation and execution, emphasizing numbers, timelines, and compliance requirements rather than theories, it reframes the issue entirely. It turns it from a political talking point into an administrative credibility test. And that shift matters because credibility is the currency of governance. Once it is questioned, every subsequent explanation faces higher skepticism. The request for Inspector General review is not an accusation. It is an admission that something in the process went wrong, whether through mismanagement, delay, or conflicting priorities. For an administration already battling internal revolt, that kind of inquiry compounds the pressure. Inspectors General operate outside political theatre. They deal in memos, records, and chains of decision-making. Their work does not disappear with a tweet or a rally. This is where Trump's strategy becomes clearer. Not in any single statement, but in the pattern. Whenever scrutiny tightens, the narrative widens. Emergencies are declared. External threats are emphasized. The conversation shifts from documentation to dominance, from compliance to confrontation. It is not subtle. It is instinctive. A reflex honed over decades. Flood the zone, change the subject, raise the stakes, and hope the audience moves on. But Congress is not an audience. It is a co-equal branch. And some lawmakers are beginning to behave like it again, pressing for subpoenas, following financial trails, and asking why certain avenues were not pursued proactively if transparency was truly the priority. This is not about proving an outcome. It is about explaining a process. And processes do not have feelings. They have records. Records are stubborn. They do not care how loudly anyone insists on their own version of events. The deeper this inquiry goes, the more it threatens to collide with Trump's preferred mode of operation: personal control over narrative rather than institutional disclosure. That collision is what he fears. It limits his ability to redefine reality on demand. This fear explains why the rhetoric around loyalty has intensified, why dissent is framed as sabotage, and why even bipartisan oversight is portrayed as partisan warfare. Because once you accept neutral review, you accept the possibility of outcomes you cannot control. Trump has always treated control as synonymous with survival. This brings us back to why Republicans themselves are so uneasy. They can see the convergence forming, war powers being challenged, emergency powers being scrutinized, disclosure processes being questioned, and internal party unity fraying all at once. They understand this is not just a bad news cycle. It is a systems test, one that asks whether institutions still function when pressure comes from the top rather than the outside. Some Republicans are now quietly acknowledging that the real risk is not what investigators might find. It is what happens if oversight fails entirely, because a system that cannot examine itself becomes brittle, and brittle systems do not bend, they shatter. This awareness has shifted the internal conversation from defence to distance, from justification to insulation, as lawmakers calculate how to separate their own constitutional responsibilities from a presidency that increasingly treats those responsibilities as obstacles. All the while, Trump continues to push forward, framing himself as besieged, misunderstood, and unfairly constrained, leaning harder into the language of destiny and personal judgment, even as the institutional machinery around him begins to hum louder, slower, and more deliberately. Because oversight does not rush, it accumulates. And that accumulation is what keeps him awake. No matter how many crises are declared or enemies named, paper trails do not vanish. Deadlines do not forget. Processes do not care about loyalty. That is why this moment feels heavier than previous controversies. It is no longer about what Trump says or tweets. It is about what he cannot fully control. For a leader whose authority has always flowed from dominating the narrative, the quiet persistence of oversight may be the most destabilizing force he has faced yet, setting the stage for a final confrontation not over ideology or elections, but over whether the institutions he governs are still allowed to govern him. This is where the story ultimately lands, not in a single vote, not in a single phone call, not even in a single emergency declaration, but in a reckoning that Republicans, Democrats, and the public alike can no longer postpone. What we are watching is not just a clash of personalities or a cycle of outrage. It is a stress test of whether American governance still functions when pressure comes from inside the highest office rather than from outside threats. The reason this moment feels different, heavier, more consequential, is that the resistance is no longer purely partisan. It is institutional. It is procedural. It is driven by lawmakers who may disagree on ideology, but increasingly agree on one uncomfortable truth. Power justified only by personal will, insulated by emergency language, and defended through intimidation, eventually turns against the very system that grants it legitimacy. Republicans know this, even if they will not all say it out loud. They understand that today's shortcuts become tomorrow's precedents. And once those precedents exist, they do not belong to one man or one party anymore. They belong to whoever comes next. That realization has transformed quiet unease into cautious action. Votes cast not for applause but for restraint. Oversight requests framed not as attacks but as necessities. Distance created not out of disloyalty but out of self-preservation. because history is unforgiving to those who confuse silence with neutrality. Trump, for all his confidence, senses this shift, which is why his rhetoric has grown sharper, his framing more apocalyptic, his reliance on emergency powers more pronounced. Leaders who feel control slipping do not slow down. They accelerate, they raise the stakes, they demand loyalty tests. They insist that only they can protect the nation from collapse, even as their own actions create the instability they warn against. That paradox is at the centre of this presidency's final act. A leader obsessed with legacy, but increasingly boxed in by process. A party torn between short-term alignment and long-term survival, and institutions forced to choose whether they will be performative or functional when it matters most. For those watching this unfold, the temptation is to treat it as just another chapter in a long-running political drama, but that would miss the point entirely. The real question is not whether Trump wins the next argument or dominates the next news cycle. It is whether the rules that govern power are still stronger than the people who temporarily hold it. That question does not belong to politicians alone. It belongs to voters, to citizens, to anyone who expects stability rather than spectacle from leadership. As this revolt continues, as oversight grinds forward, and as emergency narratives collide with constitutional limits, the outcome will tell us something profound about where American democracy actually stands. Not in theory, but in practice. Because systems do not fail all at once. They erode gradually, challenged, tested and normalized until someone finally says no. Right now, that no is coming not from the outside, but from within, from Republicans who understand that stopping a leader from going too far is not betrayal. It is a responsibility, whether that responsibility holds under pressure will shape not just this presidency, but the rules every future president inherits. That is why this moment matters so much, why it deserves attention beyond outrage, why it demands engagement, scrutiny and conversation. Because democracy does not protect itself. It relies on people willing to defend it when it is inconvenient, uncomfortable and politically risky. And that defense, quiet or loud, is the real story unfolding behind the headlines. One that will be written not by declarations or threats, but by the choices made when power meets its limits. The world is watching to see whether those limits still hold.